You've lived a great life and done well for yourself. But what mark will you leave on the world? How will you inspire future generations? Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand have helped thousands of people answer exactly those questions. If you've ever wondered, what will be my legacy? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Your Life, Your Legacy podcast. Now, here are your hosts, Stan and Katie Beth.
Welcome back to the Your Life, Your Legacy podcast with your hosts, Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. Our guest today is very unique. She is an expert on serious illness, death, dying, and bereavement. We are so excited to welcome Dr. Marianne Matzo. Dr. Matzo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So you have a very impressive background. I was hoping you could take just a few minutes and tell our listeners a little bit about your background, the work that you've done previously, and all of that has led up to being an expert in the field that you're in, which again is very cool, something that everybody goes through. And so we have a lot of great questions for you today. But to start us off, tell us a little bit about your background and some of the different things that you've done previously.
Well, I graduated from my nursing program 47 years ago, and I worked full-time from the time that I graduated till the time that I retired. So I've had a pretty varied background, starting out in cardiology and working in psych for many years. And then right around when I turned 30, I took a job in academia. And so I did that kind of worked on a federal grant related to older adults, and got my PhD in gerontology at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and went and taught full-time after that. And right after my first baby was born, I saw the Project on Death in America, which was funded by George Soros. And he was starting this program to change the culture of death and dying in the United States. He had gone through the death of his father, and it wasn't a good experience. It was troublesome in terms of getting the care that his dad needed. And he thought, well, if, I have money, I'm having trouble with this. What does everybody else do? And so he saw the way that people were dying in the United States, dying in pain, dying alone, and said, certainly we can do better. And so he funded the Project on Death in America, which was for medical professionals to, what he wanted was for us to dedicate our careers to changing the culture of death and dying in the United States. And amazingly or amazingly not, the people who were in that program, he funded 10 people a year. I was in the third group that he funded and the first nurse that he funded. And people have really lived up to that mandate, if you will, in terms of saying, what needs to change? How are we going to change it? People worked on all different aspects of this. I worked in nursing education. But as I was going through my career, I realized that, yes, it's important that healthcare professionals know how to provide excellent palliative care. But you can't do that if you have a public who doesn't understand what is palliative care, what is hospice care, what do we offer, what can we do for you? Because if just bringing up anything related to the end of life, people kind of do this kind of thing. Well, I don't know if I'm ready for that yet. I don't know if it's that bad yet. And, we'd be like, well, you don't have to wait till it's like really bad in order to get symptom relief, in order to increase your quality of life. And so as I got closer to retirement, I said, my next thing needs to be focusing on the general public and educating them about all of these aspects of palliative care and end-of-life care, and how you don't have to wait till the very end to say, oh, I don't want to be resuscitated, or this is how I want things to go. Better to do that when you're in a full state of mind. You can put it in writing, you can fill out the forms, and you can say, here's what I want, and communicate it with your family. But that's not how things go. And as much as the efforts have been in the last 30 years, we've made a change, but we haven't moved the needle as far as you think it could have been. And I always thought the missing piece was public education. And so when I retired, we started a nonprofit called Everyone Dies. And people push back against that. They don't want to hear that everyone dies, because that, just might include them. And I say, I just say to people, well, I realize that makes you uncomfortable, but it is true. We're not lying to you. And so 5 years ago, we started doing podcasts, and we do one podcast a week on a different topic. And if you go to our websites, www.everyonedies.org, what you'll see there is a wide range of topics and a way to search them to say, here's what I need right now. I need to know more about advanced directives. I need to know more about artificial food and fluids. Right now, we're in the middle of a long series about cancer, starting with what is cancer? How do you get it? Why do you get it? What happens? Take it each piece at a time. So people can go at any time that they need that information and say, here's what I need to know about this. And if you look at the other podcasts that are related to the end of life, they're primarily for professionals and talking about the current research and that kind of thing. But there really isn't this type of information in a evidence-based, but simple language, things explained about, these very many aspects of this difficult topic. So all of our podcasts are available at no charge. People can just go in and use them, listen to them as much as you want. And the sort of nice part, I think, is that families are spread out all over. So here's an opportunity for, if you have to make a decision about, let's say, artificial food and fluids, everybody can go to one place, and you're going to get the information that we would educate our students with. So the healthcare professionals, I take that and put it into layman's language and present, like, here are all the facets of that. Here's all the things that you need to think about. Here are the things that are not true about, certain things in terms of, oh, I'm going to starve to death if I'm at the end of life and I don't swallow food. And so that's a myth. And I love to tell you more about it, but you can also listen to the podcast. And so this gives people, no matter where they are in the country or where they are in the world, to listen to the same information. And it's the information that the hospice nurse gives the patient and the family who are right there in the room. But if the other people aren't right there, this is what, I was a hospice nurse too, so this is what we would tell people. So you're getting the same information. It's information you can count on. It's, not hyped up. There's no profit for anybody. We have no, dog in the fight, as you say, because nobody's paying us anything for anything. So this is an opportunity really to get the information and to make some decisions ahead of time so that you're not right at the end and saying, oh my God, what are we going to do about this?
That's great. And I'm so glad that you brought up the podcast. That was actually one of the questions I was going to ask you about. So does the podcast, does it tend to be, and with your guest, does it tend to be more on the medical side of things, or do you guys talk about the emotional side of this process as well? Kind of on that aspect, what can our listeners really expect from the podcast?
Well, we have what we call three halves in the show, and we know there's not three halves, but so the first half we talk about maybe some cultural aspects of aging, maybe a new research, if there's a new drug that's come out for Alzheimer's or something like that. Second half is always sort of the meat of the program. So whatever the title of that podcast is, that's in the second half. So we tell people, you don't want to listen to us chat with each other. Just go the second half. You can skip that. We won't be insulted. And then the third half, we'll do poetry. We do scenes from movies where there's, something interesting happens related to our topics. We do stories that people write. So we want to engage every part of a person's mind. This is such a scary topic for many people that we figured if they just came on and said, all right, here we are, we're going to talk about prostate cancer now and go through the whole thing, that I would think would be difficult for people. So we kind of ease them in, give them the meat and ease them out, and also activate other parts of their brain, other parts of their creativity to relate to a topic that people might find isn't very relatable. But they only find it isn't really relatable is when they haven't really acknowledged that everyone is going to die.
No, I love that. And I know that's true. So Stan and I work in the estate planning world. And one of the biggest reasons people don't do estate planning is because the process of estate planning really makes you think through the fact that you and your spouse are going to pass away someday. And people don't like to confront that. We all know there is a 100% mortality rate so far for the human race. We all know that it's part of life and that it's coming, but it just feels so overwhelming. And so, Dr. Matzo, from your experience, talk to us for a lot of these people, and I know you've worked in this field a lot. Getting a serious diagnosis or a terminal diagnosis feels very overwhelming. Do you have is there any sort of like a checklist that you have or topics that you suggest that people think through when it comes to kind of planning for this end of life phase that's coming?
We have, mind you, we've been doing this for 5 years. So we have a series of what I call peri-death nursing. You have perinatal, all the stuff around when you're going to have the baby. So all the stuff before you have the baby, the part of birthing the baby, and then what happens after you've birthed the baby. So that's perinatal care. Well, so I present the end of life in a peri-death model. All the stuff that happens before the death, all the details about dying that people don't know or might be relating to back when a grandparent died, and we have made changes, so it's not as bad as it used to be. And then that whole period after the death. And so there's all about cremation, burial, every aspect that you can think of related to that part after the death. It is there. And we don't just focus on the body part, but the emotional part of it too, the grief, the loss aspect of it, and also preparing. There's topics about advanced directives, there's talks about doing a will, doing a living will, cleaning out all your stuff and not leaving it for your kids or anybody else to have to go through. So all of the things that you have to think about, I won't say they're all there, but at this point, there's an awful lot that will keep people busy. And, we and lots of people believe that knowledge is power. And so if you can educate yourself about, okay, well, here's the things that I need to think about. And you kind of go through that and you listen to those, and we have a lot of resources that we put in our show notes to help you get from point A to point B, just so that you keep the control in your own life. We're especially, Americans love our control, and that whole death thing seems like that's all out of control. Well, it's only out of control if you don't kind of engage with it and say, what do I need in order to be able to manage and plan? One of the things I always tell people is that you wouldn't decide you're going to get married on July the 2nd and not do some planning. There is going to be some planning. And so either it's a lot of planning, or even if it's a little bit of planning, there's planning. And so you can do that with your own death too. You can say, I don't want to just leave this to chance. who knows what my kids will do? Who knows what they might decide. My mother was a very frugal woman. She was a Depression baby. And when she died, there was no information like what she wanted for a coffin or anything. And my sister picked out the fanciest, smanciest coffin you ever saw. And I said, Mother would be rolling over her grave if she was in her grave right now. Like, what are you spending all that money on a coffin for? And I
Yes.
know that's exactly what my mother would say. And she's like, well, she never spent money on herself when she was alive, so I'm just going to spend her money on this. It's like, okay.
That's so interesting that you brought that up. Stan and I actually, we have a presentation we do on this for our estate planning clients where we talk to them about the importance of talking to your family and planning out some of these things, or at least having the conversation about what you do and don't want. Because what we've seen over and over is exactly what happened with your sister. What we tend to see is when a loved one passes and there hasn't been a conversation, there during that grief period, those first few days afterwards, there's a lot of emotional spending. And it feels like, well, we never had a conversation with mom or what she'd want or not want. And she was the best and she deserves the best. So we're going to buy her the $30,000 gold coffin or casket, even though that's not what she would have wanted. And so I agree with you, and I know Stan would too, 100% on the importance of having some of at least a casual conversation, if not planning it all out in advance, because the last thing that you want to do is try to plan a funeral and a visitation and all of these things during a period of grief. You just don't make the same choices you would make if you were in a healthier state of mind. And that's a mistake that we see happen relatively common in our business. And I know that's something in your personal life that you saw, and I'm sure that's something that happens a lot in the professional world you've worked in as well. Talk to us about kind of that could definitely be a mistake people make. So talk to us. You've seen a lot of people go through this, serious illness and maybe terminal diagnosis. What is one of the most common mistakes that you see people make after getting a diagnosis?
Oh my God, there's so many.
You can give us your top few.
So, first off, there's this sort of denial that this isn't what's happening to me. And so it takes a little while to kind of get your head around that this diagnosis is what's going on in your body. So, people can feel like they're being betrayed by their bodies. Like, I've heard a lot of people saying, I don't have time for this. I have so much planned. I do not have time to do chemo and surgery and all of this kind of thing in the case of cancer. Some of the diseases, though, are a part of what our lifestyle has been our whole life. And so this is sort of like, I've had people with lung cancer say, God, I didn't think they were really serious about the dangers of cigarette smoke. If I'd really believed them, I would have stopped smoking. And they didn't. And now they're in the chair receiving chemo for their lung cancers. So there's that kind of thing, sort of the disbelief or even mad at themselves for, not heeding what they were being told in terms of stopping smoking is a really big one. And taking better care, make better choices in terms of their health. There's also the guilt that I did something, and so now this is sort of my punishment. So there can be feeling, that kind of blueness about choices that they've made. And that can make a lot of things very difficult because if they feel that they need to be punished, some people won't take their pain medicine, won't, do things that they need to do in order to healthfully get through the treatment that's being offered to them. Some people don't want to involve family and friends in terms of a network to help them through this. And, it takes a village to raise a child, and it really kind of does take a village to make it through the healthcare system and to be able to get to appointments and, because you don't feel like driving or you shouldn't be driving or all the other times where you need some extra help. And people don't want to reach out to people. They want to, I don't know if it's the shame and the guilt is they don't want people to know about it. or they don't want to have to say goodbye, or they want people to remember me as I once was. They don't want people to remember the after part of it. So there's a lot of these things that people go through. And so we have a lot of shows about different serious illness diagnoses and what you can expect, what are the treatments, what are the difficulties with it. And we talk about how you die from a disease. Now, not every disease that we're diagnosed with is going to be our cause of death. And that's another mistake that people make. They think, well, I've been diagnosed with prostate cancer, so that is what my cause of death will be. And, they could go and get hit by a car, and that's their cause of death and nothing to do with the cancer. And so I keep reminding people in the podcast that just because you have a diagnosis doesn't mean that this is going to be how our end comes, because we don't know how our end comes. And that's another thing that really bothers people. We like to be in control of things, and this is the big unknown, how it all will end.
No, I can relate to that, and I think our listeners can as well. This is a tough question. I promised you before we start with the podcast, I would try to keep tough questions to a minimum. But for our listeners, maybe if we have listeners that have recently been diagnosed with a serious illness or a terminal illness, if you could give them one piece of advice or one piece of wisdom from all of your years of doing this work, what would that one piece of advice or wisdom be?
Well, what comes to mind, so I don't know if it's the one piece, but what immediately comes to mind is that I think that we're in my 47 years of nursing, let me put it this way. People are more stressful of what healthcare practitioners tell them. And so back in the very beginning, 47 years ago, if I said, well, this is black, then it was taken as like almost from God's mouth. Like if the nurse tells you, it's absolutely true. And there's now less trust in what people with education experience have. There's less trust in us. And I would say we don't get paid by the person. We're not holding anything back from you. Is like what I would always do is go through, here are the options. Here are the things your insurance will pay for. Here it all is. And yes, you do have to make some decisions. You have to make some decisions about even what you want to do if you have a terminal illness. Because, is it something that's been diagnosed and you like have maybe a month to live? Well, maybe your choices are different if we're honest with you and tell you this tends to go really fast. And people always will have the story of, well, they told my uncle, Harry, 30 years ago, he was going to be dead in a month. And, he's still around. And it's like, that's great. I love being wrong. Love being wrong. But if you do this long enough, you're not wrong all that often. And so you can say, here's what the best of my experience tells me. Here's what and I go through symptoms with them. You have this, you have this, you have this. These are what it means. And so you take that information and make your best decision. But I would hear patients often say, well, I don't know if I believe my oncologist. I don't know if I believe this person. I had a dual appointment with our VA system. I was at the VA hospital and with our cancer center. And the way it worked, a lot of us went back and forth between the two places. And so I would have, some vets who would say, I'm going to go over to the cancer center. I'll get better care over there. And I'd say, certainly you have that right to do that. I'll see you over there, because I would see patients there. And the fellows in oncology that we had were the same. They were at both places. So they weren't going to get the people were the same. in a lot of cases. And so it's like, if you feel better being at the fancy smancy place and having them tell you this, then certainly, you can use your insurance and go there, or you can use your VA benefits and stay here. But the cast of characters, there's a lot of similarity between them. So I guess my answer to your question is trust the professionals that are there to take care of you. We never got a bonus for, extra patients or extra chemo or anything like that. And that's because we follow guidelines, evidence-based guidelines that say, here's what you do. It's kind of pretty well spelled out in terms of what drug, what dose, timing of it. And the rest of it is experience and personality.
Good answer. That's a great answer. Okay, before we run out of time, I did want to take just a minute to ask you about, you wrote a children's book. It's called Everyone Dies, and yes, it's normal. This really sparked my interest. 3 of our kids are adopted. Their mom passed very suddenly, and I wish that this is something that we had before all of that happened. So tell our listeners a little bit about what inspired you to write this book and kind of the target audience and what it's all about.
Well, I always said that the book that needs to be written is like everyone poops, everyone dies. And that, the buzzword is to normalize it. So if everyone's doing it, you don't have a choice about it. And the story comes from, we were with my grandson. This is a picture of my grandson.
So cute. Yeah.
And we were in Cancun, and he found this crab leg, which you can see in the picture there. He was carrying this crab leg around, and we were playing with it and figuring out how he would eat with it and this and that. And I said to him, so where's the rest of the crab? And he said, oh, I don't know. Where do you think it is? I said, well, I don't know how much biology there is, but I don't miss up an opportunity to share the facts of life. I said, well, without his arm like that, I would think that maybe he died or she died. And so we had to talk about that. Like, what does it mean to die? He was 4, 5 at the time. And I said, there's only 3 reasons that people die or animals die. It's because they're very, very sick, very, very old, or very, very hurt. And I said, this crab was very, very hurt. And so I don't know, I'm thinking that maybe they died. And so he was real fascinated with that. And so his father had been for a run. He's a nice big Marine. He comes up and he says, Jax goes running up and says, look what I got. And he's like, oh, and did the rest of the crab go home to his mom? And Jax looks at him, he says, no, Daddy, she's dead. And Marcus looks over at me like, I wonder where he got that from. And so it was that whole conversation of, so it's just a short children's book. I think it's good for like kids to maybe age 10, but it's a children's picture book. And you got to know it's the only one called Everyone Dies. And the purpose was to give a common language for the adults in children's lives to be able to talk with children about death. Because children say, why did he die? Why did Grandpa die? Why did the dog die? Why did this bird die? And in the intro of the book, I said, you probably would rather talk about where babies come from than why people die. And, to the adults. And it might be easier to explain, because why do people die? Like, we don't get into religion in the book. We don't get into what happens afterwards because we don't know, but we know why people die. And you can tell a child, you can talk with a child, here's the 3 reasons that they die. And so when his dog died, when Jax's dog died a few years later, he was kind of having these cardiac problems. I'm on the phone with Jax, so he can say goodbye to his dog. And he said, what's going on with the dog? And I said, well, his heart's very, very hurt and it's not working anymore. And because it's not working, he can't walk, he can't do this. And so we're going to just keep him real comfortable until he does die. But because Jack's learned that when he was 5, we can talk about death in that way. Which of the 3 reasons did this person die, or this animal, or whatever it is? And by normalizing it, by saying everyone does this if they want to or not, it's like, well, this is a part of life. And that's what I think we need, is that people going through life saying, this is a normal end. We're born and we live, however we go about doing that, and then we die. And that this death part isn't more scary or less in need of rejoicing than when a child is born. And so let's say that it's true.
Yeah. So before we run out of time, I want to explore something with you that we really haven't touched on at this point. And that is, we've talked about, the medical aspects of dying and treatment, making sure you have healthcare choices made, you have people designated that have the ability to make decisions for you, communicating with them what your wishes would be. There's another dimension to this, though, that I want to just take a moment and explore with you. That is to bring a framework. This is something Katie Beth and I have been working on now for the last couple of years, is to bring a framework to humans to give them a way of thinking about the meaning and the significance of life, so that they're able to really organize their thinking and have a game plan for communicating the meaning and the impact of their life. I'm curious to know, is that aspect of the conversation beginning to trickle into the dialogue that you're having with people these days?
Well, so are you talking about life legacy? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, legacy is a really unfortunate word because it's used in so many contexts, but I guess that would be the most appropriate word for it. I think that, there are some people who die, people write books about them. They talk about the impact those people had on the world because of their, the work they did, the work they did in medicine, the work they did, in foreign policy. But, the view that Katie Beth and I take is that, every one of us has the opportunity to reflect on the meaning and the significance of our life, and then to find ways to communicate that so that the value of our life experience can be communicated to younger generation family members or people who aren't even born yet. And it seems to us, it certainly, I can say, it seems to me that part of this process really needs to be a conscious, proactive effort to have people reflect on that and begin to codify or document it, to distill it in a way that has the potential to have impact over time. And I guess I'm making the case that we haven't made much progress in that yet. And that's an area where we're making an effort to move the needle on it, using particular strategies and tools, techniques, things like identifying stories that were impactful in your own life, when you were young, or stories about family members that impacted you, and how did those stories shape your decisions, your behavior? Because we know that when those stories are shared with younger generation family members, they can really have an impact sometimes. And so I think for a lot of people, I think the process of exiting this life would be received perhaps in a different way if you had the confidence that your life experience is going to be shared in a way that allows the people that you care about, your children, grandchildren, and kids that, come along that are born later, if your life experience could bring a positive impact. And I guess we're making the argument that this is something that people need to think about with intentionality. And there are a lot of different tools and techniques to do that. And some of them have absolutely zero cost attached, like writing letters to people you care about and saying things to them that are really true, things that that you maybe you never got around to saying before, And so I'm just curious to see how much of that aspect of this process is part of the work that you and your colleagues are doing.
Well, we have a podcast that's I think it's called Who Tells Your Story? And I really enjoyed writing that one because it's about, for lack of another word, it's about your legacy. And who tells your legacy story? You can leave it to someone else, but it's going to be jaded or shaded by their own view of the story. So if you want what you want people to know, you need to share it. And, then we talk about ways that you can do that. If it's a letter, if it's doing a videotape, there's lots of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the developmental tasks in aging is the end part of our life is supposed to be looking at what have you done with your life and making sense of it and feeling like you've made some contribution, you've done something that is your legacy. And so as we get older, we just naturally sort of spend some time thinking about, I have more time behind me than I have left in front of me. And actually, we have a podcast that's coming out for Father's Day. That's exactly what that's about. Is a singer-songwriter from Detroit is on the show, and his whole new album that he's releasing is looking back on his life. And so it's this, and that's how he's doing it. He's doing it with his music. But, everybody can do that, and everybody can do that in some way. And you share it so that you hope in some way that your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren won't have to step in the same holes that we've stepped in.
Right.
But in reality, they're just dying to step in those holes. That's just what they do. But then they can look and say, oh, grandma stepped in the same hole, and here's how she thought about it.
Yeah.
So yes, to answer your question, yes, we do talk about that because I think what we want to give to people is this holistic view. There's lots of aspects to getting older. There's lots of aspects to getting a serious illness, and you certainly don't have to be old to get one. There's a lot of aspects to dying, and everyone does it at every different age. And so we don't shy away from anything, as uncomfortable as it is. We just did a show a few weeks ago about, the title was When Your Child is Murdered. And it was a story that Charlie, the co-person on the podcast, we started the podcast in April, and then that May, his son was outside a bodega in New York City and caught a bullet. And it's taken 5 years for Charlie to say, I'm ready to talk about this now. And so that was uncomfortable for all of us because it was so terribly sad and we lived through it. Michael was only, 21 when it happened? But Charlie's not the only person that's happened to. And so for all the other parents who've gone through, that perspective from somebody else will hopefully help.
For sure. Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really fascinating and very helpful. As I introduced you, I said this is a woman with a very unique background. And so I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to jump on with us today and share your wisdom and your experience through all of this. I know one of the quotes that I read from you said that death is not optional, since you have to do it learn all you can do so you can do all you need to. And so I love that. I love the mentality. I think you hit the nail on the head, Dr. Matzo, when you said, knowledge is power. And so as going into this is something not to avoid or shy away from, but something that can be empowering if you're willing to really dive into it. So for our listeners, we also want to thank all of you for listening to the Your Life, Your Legacy podcast with your hosts, Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. And our guest today was Dr. Marianne Matzo. And to connect with Dr. Matzo, you can visit www.every1dies.org. And you can also check out the book and get a copy at everyonediesthebook.com. We will link both of those for you in the show notes. And Dr. Matzo, thank you so much again just for taking the time to share all of your expertise with us. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And also Amazon, Barnes & Noble has the book, so you can just
Perfect. So anywhere,
there.
All the major sellers. Awesome.
And, as people are planning your estate and the people that are listening that help people plan their estate, feel free to refer people over to us and say, you know what, listen to this, and maybe it'll help you with making this decision. If it's
for sure.
particular show that says what you need it to say, but often it takes more than one person saying something to have people say, oh, okay, I get that.
Certainly. All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Your Life, Your Legacy podcast with Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more about Stan and Katie Beth, go to pinnaclelegacylaw.com. You can also find links in the show notes.